everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And for the first time in a long time, we're in the same frame.
For the first time in, isn't that a...
For the first time in forever.
Something that's from a...
There'll be laughter. Frozen.
Frozen. It's from
There'll
Frozen.
Be laughter, there'll be fun.
I knew that was a song.
We got there.
The singing is free, folks.
It's one of our gifts to you. We are social scientists. If we've never met you before, hello. We are social scientists with PhDs who are obsessed with the idea that we can learn more about humans through the discussion of culture. We believe that curiosity can change the world because it's the only thing that ever has. And one of the ways that we do that in talking to people and talking to each other is honestly through things like analysis of art, which is what you're here for. We love talking to each other. Obviously, we turn on the recording devices for y'all. So if you've got commentary about anything we've said, or thoughts and comments on our thoughts and comments, we would love to hear them. Comment below here on the video, and we are delighted to discuss with you.
Today's video is a part of our special edition Pride Month coverage, which we've been talking about in a different context on our Colonizers World Tour playlist. So please check that out and the queer stories we are exploring from around the world. But today's video is our episode by episode coverage of the FX and FX on Hulu docuseries Pride, which started airing towards the end of May 2021. And we've decided to cover it for our kind of extended Pride Month coverage. But you know what? We can talk about Pride all the time.
All the time.
Because queer folks exist all the time, even outside the month of June.
We promise.
Shocking, I know. But we are up to episode 4 of this decade by decade exploration of pretty much just queer life in the United States. We're not going international with this one. It's solely focused on movements here in these United States. Mm-hmm. So episode 4 is 1980s underground. We have a popular saying in the United Kingdom and Ireland that something does what it says on the tin. Tin being like a can of like baked beans. And it, you know, what's inside matches the outside. It does what it says on the tin. In our humble and educated opinions, this episode did not do what it says on the tin at all. And we had some, I think, pretty reasonable expectations of what the 80s decade was going to cover.
Especially in light of what the 70s one covered.
Especially following on several episodes worth of framework. And this one, it just didn't. So the best way to handle this would not, brief recap, is not really to go chronologically because the episode was all over the show.
All over the place.
Not chronological at all.
No.
It's basically a case study of 3 humans and some of their experiences in the 80s and then some of their experiences in the 90s and 2000s, 2010s. So it focuses on Black trans woman, activist, human extraordinaire Kyan Doroshow, who I would like, please, friends at Pride, if you're watching this, please just make a documentary about her life.
Oh my gosh, hours and hours I want to know.
I just wrote down like all her quotes. She is fire, loved it.
Loved it.
Didn't fit with the 80s, but loved it. So we've got Kyan Doroshow, we've got some interesting and problematic ad-libbing by Michael Musto. We've got Nelson Sullivan, who is a documentary filmmaker who, like, that was the bit that was about the 80s. They used a lot of his home movies, and he basically documented queer life in the Village in New York City from, like, 1982 to 1989.
Yeah.
So that was valuable if scattershot in there. And then we get Anne Northrup, yeah, who is also an activist at that time. And she specifically talked about her activism and the founding of ACT UP as an organization and kind of what that did and what that continues to do. So we really just get those 3 voices with a couple other people thrown in, some Michael Mustos, some other trans folks, in a way that was really disconnected, and it made it hard for us to follow. And then we got the strangest,
these 2 like fever dream art house things about AIDS
that were just Like, and we both have done some research on AIDS. Dr. Kristen way more than me. I know more about what happened in the 80s than I'd say the average Joe, unless you lived through the 80s as an adult. But I was like, this is not it. I will finish by saying this. This was not an episode that struck me as it was filmed for an audience that didn't know.
Yeah.
Very intimately.
Yeah.
What happened in the 80s in queer life. It assumed a level of knowledge that heretofore the other episodes hadn't. And it assumed a very high level of knowledge and familiarity. That being said, what do you want to talk about? What did you like? Did you like anything about this episode?
So while, like,
this requires a position reset.
So I have really strong feelings about how much more we need to be talking about AIDS in the United States and in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we have largely forgotten it because now it is killing brown people in Africa and not necessarily black and brown people in Latin America and Africa, and
black women, I think
mostly black women, mostly African women statistically. Now that it's killing those folks, we're not having the activism that we had. And I recognize that is, I'm frequently accused of being cynical about that. And perhaps I am, but there's a pattern I have noticed. But it was the very real reason it didn't get as much funding at the beginning as it got. The real reason we didn't get as much education in the beginning as we thought is because predominantly affected gay men and then predominantly intravenous drug users. And so the United States, which is where it showed up in mass first, attached moral judgments to those with HIV in a way that I don't think have ever seen or will ever see again. It was something. And this show, to me, had an obligation, might be strong, but as far as I could tell from the rest of the documentary, we were going to dig into that. And that we didn't, I was really frustrated.
I think, and I mean, they did talk about the perception of AIDS, but it was all cursory.
Yeah.
Like they had footage of some scenes in San Francisco and like signs that said gay cancer and like.
And we heard from, Big Jerry Falwell and his opinions on, like we heard from that stuff, but all the other 3 episodes had sociologists and anthropologists sitting in and connecting dots for you. Nobody connected dots in this episode.
No.
And then, like, even before we watched, I looked at Dr. Aaron, I said, I really hope they talk about Black trans life in the 80s because I don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
So then Cheyenne shows up and is like, well, there was no Black trans life in the 80s. And we're like, okay,
cool, thanks.
Cool. And then we proceeded to hear a lot about Black trans life in the 2000s and the 2010s, which was fine. And I loved hearing her story and her personal evolution. But it was like, ballroom was really important. That statement would be made. And then nobody would explain what ballroom was, or if it is still existing now, or if it was, because the footage that we see, it certainly looks like it was only a Black space. Yeah. Is that true? We don't know. No one explained. And so from up to this point, outstanding documentary at handholding.
Yeah.
This one just went, you have to know what the 80s are, right? Like Boy George and AIDS.
Like everybody knows what AIDS is. And I just like, yes, but you have to think of the different target audiences that you want to hit. Like we were born in 1983. So we were children during the worst of the AIDS crisis. I have no living memory of the AIDS crisis. I know what I learned in the 90s and in the 2000s and then the 2010s. So you're really looking at Gen X boomers that like lived through that and might have memories, but those memories are really clouded by societal perceptions, by the media, all that stuff. So that's how the show has used academic and cultural and social analysts in the past to help unpack some of that and be like, well, this is why we thought this. And this is where it evolved from.
Yeah.
And I think too, just to your point, this might seem tangential, but I wanted to make sure I said it, that we don't talk about AIDS the way we talk about everything else, right? We've just been in a global pandemic. We've all just experienced a global pandemic as we film this. And so many people didn't reference AIDS when we talked about previous epidemics and pandemics.
People barely talked about Ebola.
Right. And they would say like, oh, well, we haven't experienced anything like this since the Spanish flu. And AIDS has killed millions of people in this country. Millions. And we just skipped over it. And I remember seeing some people on, you know, a news show be like, you know what, we people should be mentioning AIDS in this because that was a viral disease.
It still is.
It still is. That became an epidemic in this country. And I don't know if it technically qualifies at pandemic levels. It might, now that it's in so many places, but it was certainly an epidemic within the United States for a long time.
It was a pandemic within communities.
Mm-hmm.
And it is certainly, you look at the statistics for huge chunks of Africa, especially Uganda and Kenya, off the top of my head, are two of the hardest hit. And South Africa is massive. And you can say like, yeah, well, we have pills now and all this kind of other stuff. Not that a lot of people can afford.
Yeah.
The AIDS cocktail is expensive. The HIV cocktail is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of people around the world that can't afford to manage their HIV the same way people can't afford to manage their diabetes, or people can't manage to afford. There's lots and lots of things. So I definitely wanted more of a sociological conversation. And I'll be honest, as a religion scholar, the 80s is when homosexuality and religion really collided, and they dropped the ball on that one hardcore.
Yeah.
It was just a lot of like, all religious people are terrible.
When you have Michael Musto, no disrespect to him as a person who can speak about being a gay man living in the village in the 80s, like, and he's a central cultural figure of that time. He is not a religious scholar or expert. And, you know, I am not the religious scholar of the two of us. And I was frustrated at the way he just flippantly threw out declarative statements about what Christians thought about gay folks, what Christians thought about AIDS, and why there was homophobia in New York. Like, I think one of my favorite memories of this will be his just shock and amazement that homophobia existed in New York.
And still does. He's like, whenever I see homophobia in New York, I'm shocked because there's just so many different kinds of people here. Like, oh my God, the privilege of that statement.
Buddy.
Okay.
Hate to break it to you. The only place homophobia doesn't exist is Schitt's Creek.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, so like that's the moment where it was just a wide gap where I was like, okay, insert religious scholar.
Like, I don't know. I honestly don't know how you talk about the 80s in the United States without talking about the moral majority and the religious right. And if you are not going to have somebody like Nancy Ammerman, who has spent, and I don't know if Nancy Ammerman does television, but like she definitely should. Nancy Ammerman is at Boston University, I think. It's one of the Boston places. And she is one of the leading authorities on the fundamentalist shift in the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the backdrop of all of this happening.
Yeah.
And that like the SBC wasn't mentioned. I was like, oh, you guys didn't even do a Google.
Yeah.
Like it was all the lowest hanging fruit to me.
Yeah.
And that's not what this series had been. Trust me, if we watched the 1950s episode and this is what it would have been like, we probably wouldn't be talking to you guys about it.
We would have stopped covering it. Oh, for sure. And I think we watched it together because we
were finally together.
We sing the singing's for free, as we say. And we looked at each other, we were like, that was so disconnected from the other episodes. Like, do they have multiple directors for this? Reader, I asked IMDb. They've had a different director for every episode. And I was like, that's cool. I love exploring people's different lenses and perspectives, but there needs to be like a show coherence that episodes 1, 2, and 3 had. And we watched episode 5 right after episode 4.
Amazing.
Very similar. They had a religious scholar or a religious person. She's a pastor.
And
Yes,
she's
reverend,
she's the reverend. She's the dean of Union Theological Seminary in New York City.
Right. So they had that context. They had the academics again and the journalists. And so it was just so bizarre to just be like, we're going to fever dream the 80s and y'all can figure it out.
And like, it was great to have all of Nelson's archival footage.
We should say that.
And that was beautiful. To me, it wasn't that we had too much of it, is that we had too much of it without context.
Mm-hmm.
Like they would be like, oh my God, and it was so great to see Christine. And I'm like, who's Christine?
I don't know. Do you know Christine?
I
That's
don't.
Nice.
It was so great to see all these people. Tell us who they were. Like that's just, it just felt like weird. And I would say one of the things I think historians are going to be able to get from the 90s, and then once we get smartphones, we look back, is all of us have so much more archival footage of our lives.
Yes.
And there's so much less, even though we post curated things on social media, most of our phones are full of uncurated things. And so if people like Nelson turned all this over to the NYU archives, I think
so.
I think it was NYU. there has to be projects at universities that are trying to collect, like, I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement has been trying to collect
Yes.
home footage of protests and things like that. I liked getting the unedited stuff. I just wish it would have been physically framed within the documentary better.
Yeah, and it's so I wish they would have used it more to perhaps like structure the episode, or
it could have been
like they could have used it as a chronology, because
Yeah.
they made the point that it was this unique archive of gay life in the village from 1982 to 1989, and like we don't have that in any other gay community, queer community around the country from that time period
that we know of or has been told to us,
that has been unearthed or donated. And so I think we could have used it a bit more. Yeah, so I think they took the like art house feel of Nelson's documentary style
just a
and
little
just
bit too far.
applied it to the whole episode.
And it jumped a lot. Like, we'd be in a 1989 video with Nelson and then go back to 1984. I'm like, oh my gosh, can we not?
And then we really got the story of like Cayenne's queer activism and trans activism in the 2000s, and like the whole description of Glitz, which is the organization that she founded, and interviews with their staff members about like why they love working for her. And I was like,
this is all great. This doesn't belong here.
Oh yeah, and then Ann Northup brought in like Black Lives Matter protests and George Floyd, like, and how they did this like alternative pride. I forget what she calls it. That was like not pride. And I was like, whoa, where are we? And then we, you know, the 1990s, we'll cover the content in our 90s video, in our episode 5 video, but it was just straightforward, like, this is what happened in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, good.
Yeah, there was just, because it was one of those, like, I know a lot about AIDS. I want them to explain it, but I also want to learn more.
Yeah.
And there was, besides learning that Cheyenne was amazing, I really don't feel like I learned anything in this documentary. I knew the history of ACT UP.
I didn't, so that was new to me, but like, aim for the low-hanging fruit with these folks. I think like they, not the low-hanging fruit, but like aim for the low level of knowledge.
Yeah.
And like, if you get people like Dr. Kristen, who's done more reading or more experience with a certain aspect of it, cool. But like, shoot for the low end of knowledge. And it was just so incongruous.
Yeah, with the rest of the tone of the documentary.
Yeah. I think that's all I've got to say.
Same.
Same's.
We'll be a lot more complimentary, to be honest, to the 1990s. We enjoyed it a lot more because we did learn a lot, even though we were cognizant in that decade.
But I learned way more about Bill Clinton than I didn't know.
Oh, we get to talk about DOMA, guys. One of the worst things the United States has ever done to humans, that are like, in terms of the legal ability for them to choose their own partners. Like, DOMA is a mess.
Y'all, a lot of things happened in the 90s. We get some really great insights, and we'll be excited to talk about it. So we will see you for episode 5.
Bye.